SIFTA, the SIFTA program. So, welcome to our very last webinar in 2024. So, what I can say, we have planned a very exciting program for 2025. We're waiting for approval, and we will share more in the coming days, hopefully, about this program. So, the session will last around about 90 minutes. We will have a Q&A where you can ask questions, where we can discuss the topic of today. The webinar will be recorded, and the slides will be shared via email, as well as the link to the recording after the session. If you want to ask a question, raise your hands or use the chat box, and then we try to accommodate your question as soon as possible. So, SIFTA is part of the InvestEU Advisory Hub, and there's a specific window for microfinance and social enterprise finance under the social investment and skills window. Basically, SIFTA, that translates to social inclusion, finance, technical assistance, provides two different kinds of services. One is related to project advisory, capacity building, and market development, and the other services are related to rating, assessment, and evaluation. The European Investment Bank is in charge of managing the SIFTA project, and it is a continuation of the easy technical assistance. If you want to benefit from SIFTA, your organization has to be located in the EU, or has to be one of the EU 27 member states. The initial budget was available until December 2024. New budget will be allocated for 2025. Again, we will inform you about what's coming next. We don't have the final details yet. Beneficiaries could be microfinance providers, banks, non-banking microfinance institutions, social enterprise finance providers, incubators, investment funds, impact investors, and so on. The project is managed like the project advisory, capacity building, and marketing development services by Frankfurt School of Finance and Management, based in Germany. Project partners are Microfinance Center in Poland and the European Microfinance Network, based in Belgium. And the rating, assessment, and evaluation services are provided by MF Rating, which is based in Italy. So, if you want to learn more about SIFTA or want to get in touch with the EIB to apply for services, again, you will have the slides with the links. You can send an email, and then you have to complete a request for service template. And with that, you officially start the process. So, without much further ado, I will hand over to our guest speaker today. Julia, over to you.
Thank you, Jörg. So I will start by sharing my screen and more specifically my slides. If I miss questions in the chat, just as heads up, maybe Jörg, you can let me know. Because it does happen sometimes. Okay, no. So, as Jörg said, welcome to our last webinar for this year. My name is Julia. I work at the European Center for Social Finance. I'm also based in Germany, and my expertise lies in social impact management, which is what I want to share with you today. This webinar is part of a two-part session on impact measurement and assessment. The first part was held in Romania at the EMN annual meeting. And to be honest, I thought maybe I might be repeating some of the things I already said there, but I noticed that most of the people I see today in the audience are actually new to me. So I think it's not bad if we start a little bit from the beginning. So don't worry if you didn't take part in that session, because we do start with some fundamentals. But either you know this already, or I'll help you refresh your memory about what social impact is and why it is worthwhile to make of impact management a priority. We will then go into the technical part, which will also be very practical. I will use examples and we will talk about indicators and data collection for social impact management. And then it's shorter, the last part will focus on assessment and social impact reporting. So let's start from the very beginning. I usually start with a question. So do you think that good intentions are enough to achieve social impact? And I hope this slide helps a little bit clarifying that the correct answer is no. These are some very well-intentioned projects that went, however, very wrong. For example, an anti-malaria charity giving away free mosquito nets. Unfortunately, the program led to misuse of mosquito nets because they were given away for free, and people were using them as fishing nets. So actually malaria cases increased, and the water got polluted by the mosquito nets. Another program which was quite famous was the one run by Nestlé. Quite some time ago, they decided to give away free milk formula in Africa. The problem is that this led to some very serious health consequences because many mothers didn't have access to clean water to mix the formula with. So also this program, even though well-intentioned, actually completely failed. Now, in some, if not all of these programs going wrong, making impact management a priority would have definitely prevented some of the damage. But besides these rather famous scandals, impact management could help any organization make sure it is achieving the intended purpose, which is usually having social impact by improving, refining, or reorienting your activities, by determining if it even makes sense to continue all of the activities you're currently running. It also helps improve resource allocation, increase stakeholder engagement, and also nowadays it helps the organization accommodate for increasing regulatory requirements that are not just in the EU, but you can see from some of the images in this slide, it's an international trend. So the first thing I would like to do is talk about social impact, which sounds a bit abstract, but I think is important because it is a term that we use a lot nowadays, but I don't think we are all on the same line when it comes to its meaning. So this is what I think a very good definition because it emphasizes some very important elements. The first is that social impact happens through a deliberate set of activities aimed at achieving this goal. This means that our activities can take many forms and that they are intentional because social impact never happens accidentally, but we have to plan for it. The second is that social impact addresses a pressing social challenge. This also means that we know a lot about the issue and we have verified our assumptions. Something that, for example, Nestlé didn't do properly when giving away free milk formula in Africa. They assumed people had access to clean drinking water, which wasn't the case. And the third part is the social impact is a significant positive change. And this has at least two very important implications. The first is that we are able to measure it, and the second is that we can assess it. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to claim it is significant and positive. And therefore, impact management is the process to measure and assess social impact, and it is exactly what we will focus on today. So I will start with the more technical part of impact management, which is its measurement. And it's also what usually discourages many organizations to undergo impact management. So now, when we look at measurability, its difficulty tends to increase as we move through the OOI model. What I mean is that while it is quite easy to measure the inputs and outputs of our activities, it becomes more difficult to measure the outcomes, namely the effects of our activities within the target group. And it becomes even more difficult to measure what are the effects of our activities beyond our target group, which is what we call impact. So when we talk about impact measurement, what we are really referring to is the measurement of outcomes and impact. As I said, because this is a complex process and many organizations don't know how to approach it, what happens is that they either skip impact measurement altogether, or they measure only the outputs and say that this is social impact. However, if, for example, we say that we have implemented financial literacy training and our output is 30 hours of training, this number doesn't tell us absolutely anything about the effects of our training on the target, on our participants. So how do we measure outcomes and impact so that we avoid impact washing, which is basically referring to impact when only really talking about outputs? I would like to start from scratch. And one way to do this is by looking at the vision, mission, and goals of your organizations. I think this is a quite practical approach because even just by having a quick look at our website, you will probably find the information that you're looking for. The vision tells us what an organization is working towards. The mission, how the organization does it, and the goals are the milestones that are necessary to achieve that vision. So these are not just nice statements to put on a website. We can actually use it when we are trying to model impact, which is a necessary step if then we want to measure it and assess it. I brought a very famous example, and this is because during the workshop in Romania, I used this example, the Grameen Bank, and since all of you are familiar with it, I thought I'd keep this example also for this webinar. The Grameen Bank's vision, as you probably know, is banking the poor. If you check the website, they will mention this. How do they want to achieve this vision? By providing comprehensive financial services to the poor. And what goals or milestones are necessary to achieve this vision? They mention specifically that they want to first, they want as many clients as possible in Bangladesh to move out of poverty within 5 years of joining the initiative. And then here, the focus areas or group of linked activities are a local microfinance program with its activities. The second milestone is promoting the Grameen model worldwide within the next 10 years. And here the focus area, which is, as I said, a group of activities, are basically a global capacity building program. Now, for the sake of today, given also the limited amount of time, we are going to focus on the local microfinance program because this is also maybe how you can relate better considering your activities. And starting from this focus area and its related activities, we can start building a social impact model. One of the most common ways to do this is through a theory of change. I think at least you must have heard the name. But basically, a theory of change documents the impact your organization is seeking to achieve, as well as all the small steps that are in between to make sure that your activities and the resources are well aligned with said change. How does it look like? It can take different formats, but more or less they will all have some standard elements. So this is an example of how a theory of change looks like. You usually read it bottom up, starting from the problem you want to address and the target group to the activities you want to implement to address the problem. And then you go up to the inputs that you need to implement the activities, the outputs, outcomes, and finally, the social impact, which is what we want to achieve. Now, as we have seen at the very beginning of this webinar, understanding the problem and your target, as well as verifying the assumptions you have about them, is extremely important. I see Jörg. Please, Jörg.
Maybe you're going to talk about that, but I wanted to ask, so what I've seen a lot is like when we talk about the problem descriptions, it's mostly our assumptions. It's assumptions about our beneficiaries.
Yeah.
In your opinion, is that good enough?
No, and so it's a pity that we are not going to talk much about this in this webinar, because usually when we talk about impact measurement and assessment, it's the upper part of the theory of change. However, I think this was a good question because it's not enough that we based this part of the TOC in our impact model on our assumptions, but we usually need much more, and we need data and evidence that sustains our assumptions or disproves it. So the only thing I brought today regarding the topic is actually a tool. I also added a QR code because, as I said, I won't have time today to talk about this, but I think this is actually a good tool to start with if you want to dig deeper into the problem and the target. It's a social impact navigator. It's a much bigger tool, but the problem tree, it's, I think, a good starting point. Did I answer your question?
Yes and no. It was, of course, a little bit of a trick question. I apologize. One of the easiest ways to define the problem is quite often overlooked, and that is talk to the beneficiary.
And not
ask
only
them directly.
Yeah, you're right.
And get that in. Alternative is like research. It's like in our sector, it's almost impossible not to find research and impact assessments with good descriptions of the problem, but not everyone has access to that. So,
yes,
which can complicate things.
If you allow this, I will put a note because later on in the webinar, I will talk about one way you could use a practical way to look at the problem and the target when you're either missing the tools or when it's very difficult to access good data on them. Okay, so
yes, of course.
I'm gonna bring this up later. Right now, I would like to move on to see how we can actually look at outcomes and impact. So now, if you remember, a moment ago, we said that one way to start your impact management journey was to define a focus area, which is a group of activities. So we're now going to see how to model social impact through a theory of change, starting from the focus area that you have selected. You need to break down, you need to break your activities into focus area. Otherwise, it would be just a monumental task to start with a TOC that represents all the activities your company is actually implementing. So if this is the first time you do a TOC, I really recommend that you start small and build on these smaller parts later on. So we can now insert our focus area, which was the microfinance program, in the activities section of our TOC, since we just said that a focus area is a group of activities. The next step is asking, so what are the intended outcomes, the effects of the target group pursued by our microfinance program and its activities? After you do this, we can ask which outputs will lead to these outcomes. And once you're clear about the outputs, you can go and ask, what are the inputs I need to deliver these outputs? And finally, consider your entire TOC and more specifically your outcomes. What are the effects on society? So in other words, the impact that we expect to achieve. So I know this sounds very theoretical. And at this point, I think that even if our TOC isn't perfect, and it probably never will, we have already done, I think, a very valuable exercise because we have made the problem we want to address, our assumptions about it, and the target, as well as all the different levels of impact we want to achieve explicit. And this is not something every organization does. So for how abstract, I think it's a good starting point. Now, the next step is to make sure that we can measure all of this. Why? Because we want to be able to demonstrate our impact, and also we want to improve. So our exercise at this point up to this point was rather theoretical, and up for discussion, but from now on, it becomes much more practical. And that's why the next part really focuses on indicators and data collection. We have so indicators are measurable variables used to assess our inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impact. We have different types, and I tried to group them to make this a bit easier to discuss. When choosing an indicator, you might need a standard proxy. This is when measurement is impossible. For example, you want to know the income levels in your target group because you want to see if they have increased after they joined a microfinance program. However, because of the social cultural context in which you're running your activities, people are not going to tell you how much their income is. So you could use a standard proxy like spending. This is a standard indicator available on a platform that provides standard indicator, Iris Plus. We're going to talk about this later. But basically, I'm using spending as a proxy for income, since usually people who earn more, usually people who spend more tend also to have higher incomes. Of course, it's not going to be perfect, but it helps the measurability of something that was initially impossible. I'm gonna, oh, nothing. I thought there was a question. We have other types of indicators. For example, you might want to use a costume proxy. As example, I worked on a project that was aimed at reducing rural outmigration. So young people were moving out of rural areas in search for employment, and we wanted to see if after they joined our program, fewer people were leaving for jobs elsewhere by the project's end. But we couldn't, of course, confirm the actual relocations because we could not follow our participants and we didn't want to stalk them. So what we used was a costume proxy. What we did is that we looked at their desire to move. So we looked if this decreased after they've joined the program. So we couldn't measure actual movement. We looked at their desire to move. So customizing an indicator. Indicators can also be standard and direct. This is, let's say, the best case scenario. This happens when you find a standard indicator, so something that already exists that captures very well the change you mean to assess. For example, you want to assess an increase in self-esteem in your target group, and then you find an available scale that applies perfectly to your context, and you don't need to change anything, and it measures directly what you meant to measure. And then finally, we have custom direct indicators that come into use when the standard indicators available don't work well in your context. So you take an indicator and then customize it to your liking. Let's say, for example, you're trying to look at employment levels because that's what your organization is trying to do, to bring people into employment. But the area in which you're implementing your activities is characterized by really high rates of informal jobs. So a standard indicator like the unemployment rate might not work well in your case because you have a lot of people who are doing either seasonal job or informal jobs. So you might want to create a custom indicator that you call local employment rate, which measures the percentage of working age individuals in the community who are engaged in any form of employment, including informal jobs and seasonal jobs. So these are kind of, let's say, the 4 areas you can move between. In general, my advice when looking at indicators is always first to check if there's already a good indicator out there that you could use. And if this doesn't fit perfectly, then you could always modify it to fit your context. So this is like my first piece of advice. The second is that it's really unlikely that one indicator is enough if you're trying to capture a complex situation. So it's difficult to say how many you need, but I would say as a first step, looking at your TOC and the different impact levels, I would advise at least 2 indicators per impact level. So 2 outcomes indicators and 2 impact indicators, and same applies for outputs and inputs. As I said, it would be always more difficult to measure indicators as you move up the TOC, but If you only rely on output indicators, then you're doing impact washing and you're not really measuring neither outcome nor impact. And also, no indicator will be perfect. You might want to test a few of them before really deciding on what works best. And you might even, if you thought that was the perfect thing for you, you might have to change it later on. But this is normal. And the same applies to the TOC. You might have to revise it as you move on in your impact management journey. Now, I would like to give a very practical example. So we are gonna do an exercise together where we try to select, to come up with an indicator. Again, I'm gonna go back to our example and see what indicator we could use to measure our inputs. Since we are looking at a microfinance program, it's probably useful to monitor the number of trainers, the cost per trainer, the number of facilitators, monitors, or depending on the microfinance program, the loan officers, and how much they cost and the amount of capital you made available for your clients. And as you can see, this is probably nothing new to you, since either you or somebody else in your organization is already monitoring inputs anyways, because they're related to cost. So let's move up to the TOC. If we go up to the level of outputs, then this is still relatively easy. The outputs of our microfinance program would probably be the number of participants, the number of peer borrower groups formed, the number of loans we disbursed. And this is, again, relatively straightforward. And unfortunately, this is also where most organizations would stop. But we don't. So we move one level up and increase the difficulty of the exercise. So how can we measure the effects of our microfinance program on the participants? As I said before, I suggest that we don't reinvent the wheel, and we first have a look if there's already something out there, like a standard indicator that we could use. And one good place to look for a standard indicator is the IRIS Plus platform. So this is what I'm gonna use today. I will also show you later there are, of course, alternatives. But I think, again, this is a good starting point. It is for free, but you do need to create an account. Once you have your account, you can go on and create a framework. I call it Grameen Bank just because this is our example. And after this, the IRIS Plus system will guide you through a series of steps, which are very helpful in narrowing down and selecting potential indicators. So it will first let you choose between starting from SDGs or starting with impact categories. Both options are valid, but I think most organizations tend to link their activities to SDGs. So I'll go ahead and select this option, but actually the process is very similar. Here, I'm asked to select which SDG better aligns with my impact priority. And given the Grameen Bank's vision of banking the poor, I would select no poverty. So being clear about your organization's vision helps when selecting indicators. So I have selected the first SDG, no poverty, and I can move on. The system now asks me which impact theme better aligns with my impact priority. And again, if you remember, the Grameen Bank's mission was providing comprehensive financial services to empower the poor. So this makes my job easier because I can go ahead and select financial services. Now I'm asked about the goals. So the milestones necessary to achieve my organization's vision. There is a standardized list. And if you look at it, the one that would fit better, my example would be improving rural economies through financial inclusion, because it's the best fit in the case of the Grameen Bank. And then the next screen is a framework tailored to my selection. So the fourth item on the left drop-down menu is a core metric set with suggested indicators, which is actually what I was looking for all this time. So after I selected, the platform suggests to measure increased income for rural clients. And if I scroll down, even more specifically, the platform mentions client income as an outcome indicator. So this could be my starting point. The Iris Plus platform even gives a couple of suggestions on how to collect data for these indicators, but actually we're going to do this together. Of course, if you decide to do this exercise at home, I do suggest that you read the advice that is there. But what I'm going to take out of the Iris Plus platform for this exercise is the fact that it suggested that I measure client income and I take it as an indicator for measuring my outcomes. As I said also before, one outcome indicator is not going to be enough. But for this exercise, we're just going to work with one to avoid like just complicating things too much. So before we go on and see more specifically how to collect data on client income, I just wanted to let you know, as I said before, the Iris Plus platform is not the only platform where you could also look for standard indicators. There are many more. I tried to kind of make a list with the most used ones. But I would still advise you, if you're not sure, to start with the Iris Plus system because it's more generic and it covers a really big variety of themes. Instead, the others, and also I guess you can guess it just by reading the different names, are more specific, to specific fields. So you can have a look, but if you don't know where to start, Iris Plus is a good place. Now, we have selected a final indicator. I called it final, but I said also before, you will still have to test it. But for now, let's say for this example that we are going to test client income. And now it's time to think when and where is the data related to client income. Now, more specifically, I need to decide when is the best time to collect data on client income, where, so in terms of location, and from whom, in terms of stakeholders. And as Jörg mentioned before, related to the target and the problem, it's always good to have data from the people involved in the activities and probably not only from one group. So this applies for the whole impact management system. I also need to decide exactly what data I want to collect. Am I interested in quantitative data, so numbers and percentages, or do I want qualitative data, which means non-numerical information such as stories and explanations? This is a decision you might want to take already, or you might just decide to go with both options. But just for the sake of clarifying, one way to think about this is really considering with what kind of data do you prefer to work. Essentially, you can ask yourself to what extent is the data focused, specified, and structured before I start collecting it. And this diagram shows that if you choose to collect quantitative data, then you will go on the left side of the continuum because the data is structured in advance. And the measurement is used to give the data a numerical structure, usually through a questionnaire. On the other hand, in qualitative data, the structure of the data emerges later on during analysis. And so it means there are not really predefined structures for data, which makes it, in the sense, more flexible. But it depends also really what you're more comfortable with. Another way to think about this is considering how mature your activities are. So usually when we are implementing a rather novel practice or activity, it might be useful to focus more on qualitative data because we need stories and explanations on how these activities work. And when instead we're implementing best practices, which have a higher degree of maturity, the focus might be better placed on qualitative data because we basically just want to check if the programs is being delivered as planned, and we don't really need neither stories nor explanations because our activities are mature enough that we already have this kind of data. So if we're then clear about the data we want to collect, it's also easier to move to the next step and decide how do you want to collect it. Here we have a great variety of options, and this table is in no way exhaustive, but it does mention some of the most common ways to collect data. So more specifically, If we are looking for quantitative data, we'll need to learn how to design and administer questionnaires. There are other options, but if it's the first time you're collecting data, then I do advise that as questionnaires as being the first step. Instead, if you're looking for qualitative data, then you might prefer to do interviews or focus groups. So what we're going to do now is to take our indicator, which was client income that we're going to use to measure outcomes, and see how could we design a questionnaire to use this indicator and measure a client's income. So let's stick to our example and suppose that we're interested in quantitative data on client income. So here are some of the variables that I could use to design my questionnaires. For example, I want maybe to ask about the monthly or annual income levels. I want to see if there are any changes in income since the client joined the microfinance program. I want to see how, like, I want to investigate income-related decisions, like what are the clients doing with their income? Do they save it, reinvest it? And of course, I want to collect data on demographics, such as the gender, age, the occupation, and location. Now, since the latter two groups, so variables are demographics, I'm gonna leave them out for now because usually these are rather easy questions to ask, not always. Again, you have to verify your assumptions, but still they're extremely important and you should always collect it because it would help you understand if the effects of your program are more pronounced on specific demographic groups. So if they're more beneficial for specific subgroups, you might want then to do something about the ones that are not benefiting from the program so much. As I said, I'm going to leave it out for now and try really for this demonstration to show you how you could design questions for your questionnaire that assess changes in clients' income since they're joining the program, which was what we were trying to do anyways. So I could simply add a question asking the client if his or her income increased since joining the program. And I could provide two alternatives, yes or no. Right? I'm not expecting an answer because this is a trick question from my side. This is...
My answer is no.
Okay, that's great. So you passed my test, Jörg. This is a very bad question to add in a questionnaire. Why is it bad? I can think a list of 3 or 4 reasons. The first is that it's leading. So it kind of assumes that the client's monthly income has increased. It's ambiguous because it only offers 2 options. So income has changed or not. If it changed, we don't know if it has increased or decreased. So that's really some very important information we are missing there. Also, there are no nuances, like we don't distinguish between smaller and bigger changes, or in this case, actually increases. So one way to solve all 3 of these pitfalls is to reformulate the question in a more neutral way, and also to use scale questions, which allow for a neutral option. So I'm going to give you an example of how you could do this. This question now is better because it doesn't assume the income has increased, but uses the word change, which is more neutral than increase or decrease. It also allows for a neutral option, which is the middle one, that income stayed the same. And it distinguishes between smaller and bigger changes. So I don't know if you can think of an even better one, but this is definitely an improvement compared to the one I presented before.
While you were talking, I was thinking about how I would formulate the question, but I can't even think of a better one. I like it. It's good.
Okay, that's good. So this is actually a pretty simple way to show you how small changes in the question really lead to very big, important changes in the data you collect, which are extremely important when then you want to demonstrate impact. So as takeaways, because we've seen a worst practice, I have a small list of best practices. So to summarize, when you want to collect quantitative data, so numbers, you should always ask closed-ended questions. it's better to use scale questions over dichotomous, which is when you only have two options, or multiple choice questions that really complicate the analysis. You should avoid ambiguous or leading questions like the one I showed, and always you should provide a neutral response option. Of course, it's important that you are mindful of language, the literacy levels, and the access to the internet if you decide to administer your questionnaire online. And also, when you collect data through questionnaires, your respondents' identity should be kept anonymous. Now, I want to show you something else, but we stick to our client income example, so that also gives us a chance to compare a little bit the data we get and how we could get it. So let's suppose we're still interested in collecting data on client income, but let's say that we're interested in collecting qualitative data through interviews or focus groups, and it's because we want stories and explanations. So let's suppose I'm trying to design a question for my interview that deals with changes in clients' income since joining a microfinance program. Sorry. In my interview, I could ask, since joining the program, how much is your income increased and how much can you save now? Again, I guess, what do you think, Jörg, of this question?
Hard no.
Hard no.
Hard no.
I agree. This is what I would call a worse practice. This is a very bad question for an interview for multiple reasons. It is too specific. It asks for an exact amount of income increase, how much, which could be very difficult for a person to answer. And also it might feel really intrusive or uncomfortable for the person in the interview. It lacks neutrality, so the question doesn't give the respondent the option to reflect or provide a broader perspective because it leads directly towards a specific answer. Also, again, it assumes an increase in income. So the question assumes that the respondent's income has increased, which might not be the case, and it doesn't even allow for the possibility that income might have stayed the same or might have even decreased. Also assumes that the participant or the person in the interview is saving, which feels very judgmental. So the last bad thing about this question is that it tries to combine two questions or two variables, the changes in income since joining the program and decisions on what to do with the income, like saving or investing. So for all of these reasons, I would say, again, this was awarded worst practice. And this is how you could improve it. In an interview, a good primary question should be rather broad. It should not provide assumptions about the income. Neither should be mixing multiple questions because then people just don't know what to answer. So rather stick to a primary, broad, non-judgmental, open-ended question, and then you might want to follow up depending on the client's answer. You might even prepare in advance follow-up questions that might use or not depending on what the answers are. So as best practices, when interviewing or running a focus group, you have to ask open-ended questions. You always start broad to go narrow and not the opposite. You avoid questions that lead to specific answers, and you try really not to combine multiple questions into one. You prepare the questions in advance, but remain flexible to change them as the interview progresses. Just like for the questionnaire, you should be mindful of language, the literacy levels, and the access to the internet if you're doing it online. And you cannot guarantee anonymity during an interview or a focus group, but you would be guaranteeing confidentiality, which means that you will never give away, you will never match the client with the responses. Maybe one small little point, interviews or focus groups, what's better? It depends. So if you have a limited budget, focus groups are definitely more cost efficient, but they might not be suitable if the topic is sensitive, personal, or really unique to the individual. Jörg.
One thing is doing interviews. practice.
Mm.
Because you will be nervous when you do your interviews. You will be nervous when you do a focus group. And what happens is you ask 3 questions as one.
Yeah, I
It's
agree.
like,
I cannot hear you anymore.
I muted myself. That was all I wanted to say.
Okay, okay, thank you. But that's a really good point. Of course, you will never get a perfect first interview, but as you practice, you'll get better. I completely agree.
Yeah. And did you say record the interviews somewhere?
I didn't put it. I think it's for the best, especially if you want to make the best out of the data. Sometimes it's not possible. But yes, I think you should record the interview. And of course, if you do so, you always have to ask for permissions. But yeah, the advice would be always to record them. So it's a good thing I could add on this slide. Thank you. Maybe one more point about also kind of the differences between different data collection strategies. Doesn't matter what strategy you choose, it is somehow flawed. So this is because there is an arrangement of these various methods along 3 dimensions: measurement, precision, and generalizability, and contextual realism. So what I want to say is that at best, a method can be very good in 2 of these dimensions and will be less effective in a third. So for instance, a very well-designed questionnaire, if you administer it to a large sample, probably will be will have high measurement precision and generalizability, but it will lack contextual realism because you're missing basically all the contextual information. So what is important to remember is that every method has its limitations. So one way you could approach these limitations is by combining different data collection strategies together, either by using them in parallel or sequentially. And yeah, what I want to show you is an example of how you could do this. So let's suppose I have collected data on clients' income through a questionnaires with very good question. And these are my results. So very simplified, but you can see from the chart that nobody in my microfinance program who has filled the questionnaire experienced an increase in income. So on the contrary, 20% of them, for 20% of them, income decreased significantly. For more than 65, it decreased slightly, and for above 15, it stayed the same. So it doesn't look good. And if I only see this, I might even think that my program was rather unsuccessful. I see a hand.
Yes, I just wanted to say that even though typically this quantitative data seems to be associated with the very rigorous collection, it's very much based on people's perception. And in many times, even in this situation where you discuss about increased or decreased income, maybe they're answering to their capacity of doing something with that money, and you're not capturing that. And I think this my point is that even though we are somehow relying on this quantitative, I think it needs some backup information for you to really understand where the people really are in terms of.
Yes, I agree. And I'm coming to specify this in a moment, but I also I take this point because I think it's a good mental note. There's no objective. It doesn't matter like how you collect the data, no method will be completely objective. So I think we are always chasing the myth of being objective. But the moment I design a questionnaire, it's not objective anymore because I have designed it. And as you said, especially if I rely on self-assessment, like it is the case in this question, somebody is self-assessing their income, and then I'm again not in an objective position. So I think objectivity is just a myth. It's very hard to achieve, and it's completely fine. But I agree. I also don't like this juxtaposition between quantitative and quantitative as being more rigorous. Like both strategies are valid as long as you if you can make sense of it in a purposeful manner. And
Yeah.
I wanted to add, which is what you were kind of leading to, if you use them together, then you would overcome some of the limitations. So what I wanted to show here is that at this point, I set up the data and I think, okay, this looks really bad. Probably my program was unsuccessful. Let's say that, however, I decided to also run interviews, and I have complemented my questionnaires with clients' interviews, and through qualitative data, I get an explanation. My clients had a very poor harvest due to unpredictable weather patterns, which led to a drought and crop failure. So actually, they use the funds of my program to cover for basic necessities rather than saving or reinvesting. So now my microfinance program looks less of a disaster, and I might also have a better explanation that I did until that moment. So this is just to emphasize that collecting data through a balanced approach helps assessment, because the quantitative data usually helps me understand what happened, while the qualitative data gives me deeper insights into the why and how. And usually these two things go hand in hand, especially if I want to have a more comprehensive strategy. Now, maybe a question which I think is very relevant and sometimes I do get asked is like, so what is good data in the end? And to conclude this part of the webinar, I just would like to say that all forms of data are credible, which is kind of going back to what Joanna pointed out, and they're also valid as long as they're used in a purposeful way. So for also how good your data is, you will always need the essential human ingredient. So I call it the alchemist, since you're the one that needs to use it in a purposeful way. This also means that while questionnaires, interviews, and focus group are common ways to collect the data, especially for impact management, they're not necessarily the only way, and they're not the best one always. And that's why I go forward, but I want to talk about an example. And I also promise to go back to what Jörg said in the beginning, to get data from the people involved in the program, especially when it comes to understanding the problem and the target. So this was my promise to you, Jörg. This is an example. It's not necessarily linked to impact assessment, because this is an example of a group of researchers that was trying actually to understand the problem. It was a new funded project which explored how to better integrate all their participants into the everyday life of their communities. And so it's not necessarily a financial inclusion program, but still I thought it was interesting, because project members had to come up with with a very different way to collect data on the problem they were trying to address, and also to understand their target. So participants in the program were geographically dispersed, first of all. And so the researchers thought they would do then online interviews to understand their needs. However, it also turned out that all participants were over 85 years old, which was a struggle with tools like Zoom. Also, they thought, okay, then we will do phone interviews. But having a long phone interview was also not an option because of their old age and fatigue. And so the researchers just created what they called cultural probes, which were basically some physical packets containing tasks that were sent to the participants. They were actually tailored depending on the location, but just to give you some examples, these probes contain postcards with questions to answers. So postcards were something the participants were more familiar with than, for example, an online tool. There were maps of participants' communities with annotation tools to understand their integration within the community, and also disposable cameras for taking photos in relation to particular topics. Again, cameras rather than something, let's say, more modern. So this is how they initially gather data to understand the problem and the needs of the participants. Also because, as we said, the participants were not gonna feel good about having a 2 hours long interview. They decided to give them the time to use the props over a period of weeks, and then they send them back. And then they did the interviews later on, but they were much shorter because they already had collected part of the data through the probes. So I don't know if you like this example, Jörg, but I thought it was actually a very creative and interesting way to overcome some of the challenges to data collection when it comes to the problem and target, but still get the very real insights of the people that will be participating in the program.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I love this example. And no, I think what we see very often is this, what you mentioned here, this fatigue in interviews, questionnaires, and it's like, oh no, not again a questionnaire. And even though there's like good intentions, the data is not very good because people are tired and don't want to do it, and it's just getting through with it if you're lucky. So an alternative way, I think, is, I really love the idea, for example, with the postcards. Could be something which is very different, more engaging, and maybe also requires reduction of the things you want to measure.
Yeah, I also thought of bringing this example just because, as Joanna mentioned, it's not just about questionnaires or interviews or getting numbers. Like sometimes you need more and you need to be more creative with your data collection. Doesn't mean that then the data is not good just because it's postcards instead of an interview. I think, Joanna, your hand is up.
And if I can say one more thing, there's quite an interesting article. I don't know if you've referenced that, from Dr. Parolo. And what she did, she was using images to prompt responses, for example, rather than just asking a question, which can be too technical.
And too boring. As you said, people are constantly bombarded with information and requests for stuff. So if you can find different ways to engage the data you want to extract, like the people that you want to extract the data from, it's also in a more empathic manner, that's all for you to gain.
My comment was around the idea of if you go for quantitative data and you have a pool of people you want to ask, I think it's good to have samples of people and not to repeat the questionnaire to the same people all the time, because then the data doesn't, I mean, you get to a point where you get always the same question, the same answers, and I don't think that's helpful. And then you get the people frustrated that
yeah, I also think because it shouldn't be a burden.
Yes.
So because we're trying to help somebody, so it shouldn't be, yeah, I completely agree. Okay, so we all agree. What I still maybe wanted to mention now was that in the initial part of the webinar, I also mentioned how usually one indicator is not sufficient to capture a complex situation. And so even if we've seen how to collect data on client income, it would make sense to find additional outcome indicators. For example, in the outcome section of our TOC, we mentioned that during our microfinance program, participants are incentivized to repay loans. So we might want to add another indicator, such as client commitment, and we might want to collect data from a different target because it's always good to get different perspectives. And in this case would be the loans officers. So this is just one example. I'm also not gonna go into the details of how to do this, but it was just, I think, to start with 2 indicators per impact level is a good start. And if you can mix it up, which means not always collect data from the same people. One reason is also what Joanna mentioned, like you're just gonna bore them and they're not gonna give you good data anymore. And you also get to get different perspectives and possibly not only using one data collection strategy. Good. So now the third and last part of the webinar is about assessment and reporting, and is also much shorter, so don't worry. Assessment follows data analysis and answers the question, what does the data tell us? Here are some basic best practices related to impact assessment. The first is to interpret the analysis without overwhelming the facts and speculating. One way to do this is by focusing on the drivers of change. And just a moment ago, we have seen how qualitative data can help us in this regard, because it helps us with it's part of explaining the findings. Also, it makes sense to use assessment to highlight your wins, to keep your staff motivated within your organization. At the same time, you cannot ignore what went wrong with your program in the assessment phase. The best way to tackle this is already thinking on how to address these setbacks so they don't demotivate the staff. But to be realistic, because that's why we're doing the impact management exercise in the first place, is also to see what is not working in our organization and what activities are maybe not achieving the impact that we initially thought of. So the last thing you'll probably do with your social impact data is to report it. And as I said earlier, many organizations fail to report data on outcome and impact. And even if they call them impact reports, usually the report really just focuses on the activities and the outputs of these activities, which don't tell us anything about the effects on our target and the participants. So I do hope that with this webinar, I've shown you some tangible steps you can take to measure and assess your impact so that you don't stop only at the outputs level. Unfortunately, I don't have a standard structure I can suggest for an impact report. And the reason is that the structure really depends on your target audience. In general, I do think that if you have a clearly defined theory of change, this could help you structure your impact report. And because, of course, you might want to emphasize different parts of the TOC depending on whom your audience is. So for advertisement and fundraising, you might want to emphasize the positive impact the organizations are having. Or for fundraising, you also may want to emphasize especially the problem that your organization is tackling. What else I can add is that also a good practice when producing an impact report is to use visual elements. Doesn't matter in this case really who the report is for, but I think visual elements, if used purposefully, are always a good idea. So I'm going to show you very quickly two tools that I do hope to explore more next year, as I have in mind a couple of webinars on this specifically. Regarding your audience, it might be useful to use what it's called an empathy map. This is just one example, also very simplified, but it should help you decide what is the job your impact report accomplishes by making you reflect on what are the pains and the gains of your audience. And before you even do that, on deciding who your audience is. Another, I think, useful tool that I use a lot, especially regarding visual elements, is the visual format framework. This could help make you, the visuals you choose more purposeful. I find the third row especially useful because it groups visuals into 4 different categories. For example, do you want to visualize a process or a structure, and do you want it to speak to the head of the hearts of people? And this also depends very much who your audience is. Maybe for fundraising, it will make more sense to use pictorial visualizations because usually appeal to the heart. If maybe instead your report is for somebody else, you might want to use a different strategy. A couple of more things that unfortunately I won't really be able to go into detail with, but of course the whole impact management journey you're gonna take can be much facilitated by software and AI tools that should help make your job easier. These are just some examples, and there are just many more out there. Typical of data collection for questionnaires are Google Forms, SurveyMonkey. For data analysis, it can even be done with Excel, depending how sophisticated you want to get. SPSS, if you get more sophisticated. If you're trying to look at qualitative data, MaxQDA and NVivo are good options. And lately, I've been trying to use an AI power tool inside 7, and I'm actually very surprised because it's enough to upload a recording, for example, of an interview, like Jörg was mentioning how important it is to record it. And not only it automatically transcribes it, but it also helps you a lot analyzing. And you get to ask the tool questions, and the AI will actually select the part of the data that could answer the questions you have. So really extremely helpful and very cost effective. If instead you're looking for something more comprehensive, so something that helps you throughout the whole impact management journey, so from data collection, analysis, assessment, and reporting, then the three tools at the bottom are probably the most well-known, but I can't vouch for any of them because I never really use them. Something that you could get, like to get even more support, and I think this is really an overlooked option, is the collaboration with research institutions. Like these collaborations are often actually a win-win solution since they provide a cost-effective option for microfinance organizations that lack resources for impact management, but also for students or researchers who often struggle to get real data from the field. So even just advertising a bachelor or master thesis on your website that students would complete with data they gather from your organizations or one of the programs you're running could be extremely beneficial, and would take a big load of your impact management system, especially when it comes to data collection and analysis, which do take usually a lot of time. I've added here the website of, I think, a good network that really provides best practices when it comes to collaborating with universities specifically. And maybe as example, it's an organization I know, and I think they make the best out of these types of collaborations. They're also based in Germany, and they're actually a manager of catalytic capital. They do have part of their website dedicated to an open call for research collaborations on impact-linked finance. So the open call means like it's always there. Anybody could actually, let's say, apply. They don't pay researcher nor students, but they do provide the data, which is usually what we're, as a researcher, I can say this is usually what we're looking for. They even provide a list of topics they are interested in, and also related timelines on when they would like these topics to be addressed. So I've been quicker than I thought of. I do have a couple of, like, I could either already take questions, I don't know, Jörg, or I do have some backup slides, which I thought I would bring up if I was relatively quick.
Whatever makes you feel more comfortable.
I mean, if there are questions, because I haven't been looking.
There were no questions.
Okay. Are there questions? Otherwise, if there aren't, I'm happy to present a couple of slides more, which I thought and actually they're based on questions I got when I did the presentation in Romania. So they are in a way also questions. Okay, so I go on with that, but somehow now yeah, so this actually is a question I think I get quite a lot, and it's always very difficult to answer. And it's the question of additionality. So I'm pretty sure whoever is here today has heard this word, but just for the sake of clarifying, of course, we want our program and our activities to be additional to what would have happened anyways. The problem is that how can we demonstrate additionality? So how can we show that what we did and the effects that it had on our beneficiaries would have never happened if we didn't exist. And our beneficiaries would have not been so in a much worse position if we didn't provide, for example, the microfinance loan. So in a way, and maybe to much of Jörg's liking, the question of additionality is very philosophical per se, because it assumes that you would be in parallel universe that work exactly the same, and then you can put the same people in the same universe and see what would have happened depending on the conditions that you set for them. So as of now, I'm not aware of any impact management expert setting a parallel universe. But what I know is that one way to, that this has been kind of an established way, is to set up randomized controlled trials. So when we look at the spectrum between qualitative and quantitative methods, in the very far part of the spectrum, like the most quantitative you can get would be a randomized control trial, which basically means you're setting up an experiment where you would have very similar people that you could possibly argue they're interchangeable. And then to some of them, for example, you would give the microfinance loan, but then you would still track the control group who didn't get the microfinance loan and see how they're doing. And then if they're doing worse off, you could always say that your program was indeed additional to what would have happened. The masters of randomized control trials is the JPAL lab. They also won a Nobel Prize for how they did this. And maybe as you're understanding from my tone, this is something very difficult to do in practice. It's extremely expensive. It requires a lot of expertise that probably most of the organizations that are here today, and myself, I put myself in this group, don't have. And they might also be ethical concerns because maybe not every organization is willing to set some people aside and not giving a microfinance loan so that we can test what's better. So this would be the practical implication of measuring additionality. I do think they're not very practical. And that's why my next slide is also what I talked about in Romania, was like, is there anything we can do to demonstrate additionality if we are not the JPAL lab? And I think there are some little things one can do, and I think they're all valid. One, for example, would be to demonstrate that people who were not served now have access. I've been also asked, and how do you demonstrate this? For example, if your questionnaire includes a question on how many times this person has tried to get a loan from a traditional banking institution, and you can see that you have been the third or fourth option for them, then you could demonstrate that your program is additional because this person would have never got a loan anywhere else, and you can demonstrate it because they filled the questionnaire and they've told you, or in an interview, that they couldn't get loans anywhere else. So I think this would be a way relatively easy to demonstrate additionality. You could demonstrate that they have increased access to the services. So maybe they were not served, but they were underserved. this could be done in a similar way, or they were getting the wrong services. So I think this could be a way to overcome part of the difficulties that come with measuring additionality and especially setting up randomized controlled trials. I don't know, again, if you have, am I missing something? Okay, nothing. And that was actually what I had with regards to additionality, but I do think it's a big topic, and I know that most of the people are indeed interested, but then they get very much discouraged on how to do this in practice. So I thought this could be a relevant way to frame it without requiring basically any additional cost.
Julia, thank you so much. I could listen to you for at least 2 hours.
I don't know about this. I
on top
I
of
did
this one,
expect to talk more somehow.
I would like to make a comment, and this time I want to ask you if this is a valid approach or not. I can think of, for example, in-depth interviews with beneficiaries, with participants, with borrowers, where you explore what kind of support they receive, outside, for example, a microfinance framework, like business development support, trainings, coaching, mentoring, what have you, the loan, where they found support, to explore that. And then it could be, out of my head, yeah, I found a very good tax advisor, and my accountant is taking care of that, and he has really excellent advice that really helps me a lot. Or I found help in the family, or there's another business owner I know, and we started collaborating. So in these narratives, you can find, or maybe you find hints and preliminary evidence related to additionality. But I don't know if, in your opinion, if that is a valid approach or not.
I mean, in general, I think that by emphasizing, for example, how an interview might bring something out that you haven't thought of, like the example you gave with the tax accountant, makes it, for some specific aspects, more valid than a questionnaire, because you would have not put the question about the tax accountant in the questionnaire, so you might have then missed this information. But I don't know how far you can go with this to claim that it is additional, because then we go back to the parallel universe if they would have not found this tax accountant in any ways without you. But I think, again, using a pragmatic approach, you could then ask, what were they doing before this came into their life? And then you could still argue that this is additional to what they had before. You probably cannot argue this is additional to what would have happened anyways, because you don't know what would have happened.
Yeah, I mean, you have the limitation. It's only like with the person you have an interview with. So you have a limitation there.
Yeah, yeah, of course.
So it's probably not so much about generalizability, but it's more like how we interpret the data. So, and also the tone, how we provide information, how we write our impact assessments. So probably be a little bit more careful and saying, yeah, we have the best program in the world. I'm exaggerating. And look how successful it is, and such a great impact on the community based on the data you collected. That's very
but
interesting.
That's what many organizations do. Not that they don't do anything, of course they do, but what I was saying, this impact washing is also not done with a bad intention usually. It's just that because you stop with at the outputs, then that's the only thing you can vouch, like that's the only thing you can demonstrate. And everything that comes after is your speculation on how these outputs are helping a community, but there's no evidence for it besides that you think that this is the case. So I do think, like, if I have one wish for today is that the organizations that are here represented today, they do try to go that step further, because I do think is important. And also, as I showed, like, it's never gonna be perfect, and it's also impossible if it is, because the world is changing constantly. So even if you have the best TOC in place, COVID starts, I don't know, hours, like whatever is happening will influence your activities as well. So you will have to change a little bit how you were measuring and analyzing data anyways. But if you don't start, then there's no way to improve the process. So even if it's expert interviews, and maybe you cannot generalize, but it's the first 10th, it would at least help you start the process. It would help you getting better at doing the interviews. The problem is that then many will stop there and use 3 success stories to put in their impact report, and this is the claim. But I think the process could be set up better. And as you've seen, I think if you have a TOC in place, I mean, now I skipped this whole part, but it's also a very valuable organizational exercise, because it means that everybody there has to agree on what you're trying to do. And so it's also really building organizational capabilities, keeping the staff more motivated. It's not just about the social impact on the beneficiaries, but it has also, it's a really valid point for an organization to have something like this, because anybody who's working there or applying to work there could at least knows what they're doing. And it's just starting a TOC, it will be full of disagreements, but that's the point, because at least you're talking about them. If you don't have the TOC, you probably still have the disagreements. It's just that nobody is making them explicit. So even if it's not perfect, I think it's a valid point to start from there, without the
Thank you.
randomized control trials in place since day one.
The fridge problem, yeah. I think you mentioned something I found extremely helpful and valuable. I mean, there's in the research community, I wouldn't say it's a debate. I think it has been settled by now. But the question of what is truth, you know, the consensus of truth, correspondence theory of truth, and I don't want to say it depends on whose book you read, but the question is, how do we interpret the data? So, like, really, we can try to look at the data very from a neutral perspective, but as you said, we will never be objective. We have a certain way of reading the data, of interpreting the data we collect. And I find the suggestion you made really helpful, to collaborate with researchers, and that can be students.
And it's for free.
Because they can bring in this perspective. They don't have your experience, and that's a benefit. Maybe they can look up some literature and say, yeah, we have a similar phenomena in Romania. We see that in other countries as well. Based on the literature research they do, and you can compare the data you collected, your interpretation, with, for example, what researchers have to say or what the literature says. And I also find it always very helpful to have a second pair of eyes to look at the data. It's very interesting when you compare and discuss this data, what comes out of these conversations.
Yeah, and you can use this second pair of eyes, there could be many more, also to make the organization aware of the data anyways, because you will need, so if you involve them in the interpretation process, it helps. One thing I didn't mention, which I think is also a good practice, but again, I was trying to keep it as a first step, and I think the more you add, like I wouldn't add everything since the very beginning, it's participatory research, which means you involve your beneficiaries also in the data analysis and interpretation, because they probably know more about the context than yourself. So this is also a very valid step, which is becoming also commonplace. But again, I wouldn't start with that if it's the first time that you're collecting data from the beneficiaries and then ask them to come with you tomorrow and implement a software and see how to make. So I wouldn't do that. I would add this later or discuss the TOC with them after you're having an organizational stance on it that everybody in the organization agrees. So I think it's a valid step, but it should be done later if you're kind of new to the whole impact management part. Yeah.
Say
but again,
something. I want to say something, because you remember about Romania. In Romania, specifically about the social economy organization, many of them, they collect quantitative data, but in Romania, we didn't have a very specific tool about measure and evaluate the social impact. And on AFIN, because we have already 40 clients who receive loans from our institution, on March, we'll collect all the data for our social impact for 2024. And I'm wondering if we could develop a specific tool to learn these social economy entities, to collect own data, and at the same time to evaluate and measure. Because theory of change is specific known for us, because most of the social economy organization, they receive different grants, they have competence to analyze data, they work with a different research center, but not all of them. They put this data in a very specific report. That's why I'm wondering, because I appreciate a lot your presentation, because I think it's useful for us to collect different questions for them to respond, and after that we'll be able to collect all of this data to put in a social impact report, and how get these loans help the sector of social economy in Romania. Because without these loans in Romania, we do not have any financial instrument to grow, to accelerate the startup social enterprises, because in Romania we have a lot of social enterprises who are in the startup phase. Yeah, and maybe in the next future, maybe we could collaborate to develop this kind of tool.
and so what do they do with the data as of now? They just keep it for internal purposes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There's one thing I would say here, and Julia, correct me if I'm wrong. This whole data collection, data analysis is a really very time-consuming process.
Yeah.
And sometimes you find things you don't want to see.
Agreed.
And sometimes you feel, I see it in the data, but I don't want to report it because it would be very critical. So that's part of the game. So when it comes to social businesses, social enterprises, I think what's important is that we broaden the perspective. So when you think of health service, or let's take childcare, then you can find a huge list of potential indicators which you can observe or which you can measure. But there will be elements you can't observe, or only very, very difficult or it's very difficult. Like, how do you measure learning? Just because you learn something, that doesn't translate directly into a measurable change of behavior. So, and when you work, for example, with youth at risk, and I'm not talking unemployment, but probably criminal activities, or you can't take them out and say, okay, no, you need new friends. So this is a longer process, and that is really difficult to measure something or to get something out of interviews directly. And here I think it's more important that we broaden the perspective and try to find people around them, like the brother or the sister, the parents, the neighbors, and involve them, or try to involve them. It's like, do they see a change? When you think of urban development, for example, of low-income districts, it takes 20, 25 years until you really see a change sometimes. So, but you need to provide data now. So, and then it's, what do we see? And I can give you an example from the city where I worked. There was a part of this town which was really underdeveloped. And then they built a new building, made it really colorful. And then you try to see, can I observe something? No, you can't observe anything within a year or 2 years. But after some time, you see people start to clean the street, the sidewalk. People start painting their houses as well. They started with smaller repairs. But in the meantime, you can talk to the neighbors. Like, does it have an effect? What do you feel about this new building being here? And that is something quite often we are not really thinking about, to go a little bit broader. But it might be helpful, especially for the social economy, if I can call it that. But Julia, maybe I'm wrong.
No, I agree. It's also something we didn't mention because we stopped at outcomes. But then the next step would be, if you really want to see impact, to look at society at large, and if not society at large, from anybody who's not a direct beneficiary. So this is sometimes a difficult step depending on the specific program, who you can talk to. But of course, it's very valuable, like if you can do something like this. And again, I also agree about broadening the perspective. It doesn't always have to be an interview. It doesn't always have to be a questionnaire. It doesn't have to be a representative sample. Like, you have to start somewhere. And sometimes you have to be creative on how you get this data. But just to say it's too difficult and not doing it, then it doesn't help.
Presentation of some study case who has very positive impacts. I don't know, to measure the number of employees from different vulnerable groups who are employees or something like this. Yeah, because except the incomes and the impact of the social enterprises ingress of the venue on other financial parts, for us is very interesting to see the social impact in the society, in the community, and the quality of life of people. Yeah.
If I can say something probably a bit more challenging, what we see very often is there's this tendency to report the good cases.
Yeah, absolutely. Success stories.
Success stories, yeah. Sometimes it's called story selling. You just to sell the good story. But it would be, like in Julia's example, it would be much more interesting to look at the cases where they report, oh, this didn't really work, and to try to understand why it didn't work. Like in the example, Julia's example of the farmer, It was like, oh yeah, we had weather effects here. We had a bad crop. And then rather than being able to buy better seeds, we were struggling and we were fighting for survival. So, and it's like, oh yeah, this is what microfinance does. This is what we're doing. This is why we're here. We're here to help the people. But understand that. And I think there is a better understanding and more value in these narratives than just focusing on those who created 10 new jobs where the revenue goes through the roof. I mean, I don't want to tell you what to do.
Yes,
No, but I think,
thank you.
sorry, what I want to say, just to add, which is, it's a bit about what I was saying about the impact reporting. Who is it for? Because if you're trying to fundraise, you don't maybe want to highlight all your failures, which is completely understandable. You don't want to advertise how bad you did something.
It's for it's our public institution, because in Romania, the social economy organization, they didn't have any fiscalities, any support from our minister. Indeed, we have a law of social economy. Every social economy organization have only obligation, but without any support. That's why we want to bring to face the public institution to related to the social impact of this organization, because to develop a social economy a social business plan is more difficult as classical companies. That's why we want to create a report about the social impact of this organization.
Well,
Okay.
then, congratulations. I hope you go further with this exploration. And anyways, you, like with the interviews, like you probably will not work perfectly the first time, but somewhere you have to start. It's always like this. And I do encourage like organization like yours and many others, because as somebody who is in the university, I teach there, I have my, like, we really always struggle to get data, not just in a utilitarian manner, like I need the data because so I can graduate. It's more like to get data that is worthwhile having, because it would really help somebody if I was to have a look at it. And even without being too high the ranking, like even for bachelor and master students, like this would be already something that could help to, yeah, a little bit building capacity in this sense. And I have the feeling like so little organizations still do this.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so Julia, many, many, many thanks for being with us today. Thank you for the support of the year. We hope to continue this excellent collaboration next year. I'd like to thank you all for staying until now. We wish you Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. And hope we see each other soon. Thank you.
Thank
Merry
you.
Christmas, happy holidays. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.